your AppExchange packages putting your org at risk. Really, we're talking about the more about how you could appropriately be doing a security assessment, or should be doing thinking about the security around AppExchange packages, and not specifically only the package, but also, and all components that come along with that package, whether it's server, have additional server components off platform, or everything entirely living in Salesforce. So again, here's the agenda. A lot of it's the same as always. So this is the 4th edition of Salesforce Security Office Hours. So I'm just going to go through some of the formalities first. And first part is just, talk again through why, what are Salesforce Office Hours? I know a lot of you have been here before, but just for the ones that have not, Salesforce Security Office Hours, basically I created this in response to a troubling reality that data breaches in the Salesforce ecosystem are ever increasing and not declining. And way too many organizations are losing sensitive customer data to attacks that could have been prevented. And these sessions exist to change that and change the way people are thinking about Salesforce security out there. Every session we are looking at real world breaches and sharing Salesforce specific security best practices that are presented by myself and other Salesforce security experts to help give you at the end of every session actionable steps you can take to strengthen your data security and reduce the risk of a breach in your environment. So I always tell everyone, make sure that you take good notes, hopefully take some things with you at the end of the day. And this is an open forum, so anybody can ask questions at any time. Just be respectful. So that's the next slide here, is be respectful to the others. I encourage open engagement. So please, treat this like it's a Dreamforce session or EX session where you want to ask questions. Raise your hand if you have questions, or just speak if I'm not already talking or someone else is already not talking in the session. Just for those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Meyers. I'm the CEO and founder of EzProtect, a virus scanning platform for Salesforce. I'm also a CTA, been doing this for over 18 years in the ecosystem. And I wrote this book, as I always tell everyone up here, about a customer of mine who actually got breached. And that's what really got me into all of this myself, is being part of a data breach. Again, just because this my my company, my show, so just saying that this is actually, all of this is being funded and supported by EzProtect. So in case you don't know, Salesforce doesn't scan for files or malicious links, and what we do is we help protect customers' data in Salesforce by scanning all those files coming in from malicious links or in viruses and so forth, and also helping provide you with insights into how you should be protecting your data. If you're interested, you can click the QR code. All right, great. So what I like to do at this point is always just do a recap from last week. Last week we had Mika on. He was talking about some of the things about permissions and misconfigurations that could lead to data breaches in Salesforce. We talked a little bit through the fake data loader apps and different types of things about OAuth flows that that we've been seeing in some of these breaches lately. We also talked a little bit about how Chrome extensions can also expose your data to attackers, because a lot of those Chrome extensions don't even use an OAuth app. It's just piggybacking off your session, and then someone could for example, shoot off a Chrome extension that look fine, then send an auto update, and then all of a sudden your data is exposed. We talked a little bit about named credentials and how to secure those outbound APIs, and some file upload vulnerabilities as well. Kind of got into that. So if you want to see the session, there's the QR code. All right, great. As I'm like to do every session, if there's any recent news, I'm gonna always want to talk about it in the very beginning of every session. So here we go, hot off the press. Alliance Life, I think it's Alliance Insurance. They had their data stolen in a Salesforce on July 16th with the data loader hack that's been going on. But then just recently on the 13th, we just heard that the attackers actually released 2.8 million records that were leaked on a Telegram channel that included things such as individual information, partner information, names, address, phone numbers, date of birth, tax ID numbers, all that fun stuff. And the thing that really concerns me is my data is in there. So I'm not so happy about this myself as well. So, but if you want to read some more about the attack, that's the link right there. I can put that in the chat later if you guys want that, or Tristan can do that as well. So Anyway, gonna move on to the actual topic at hand. Are your Salesforce AppExchange packages putting your org's data at risk? And as I kind of mentioned, the reason I'll give you a little bit of a where this came from for me was that I was talking to some people the other day about just generally about the security reviews. Then we started thinking about AppExchange packages. Do you really know what's in your AppExchange package? Especially if you think about like the Apex code that you can't see that's in that package. Do they maybe are they maybe sending a call out and sending your session ID in the call out to cheat and coming back in? Did someone build in a back door? And are they even using secure practices in that package? Like how deep when you're onboarding a new vendor, like for example, like us, to your org, how deep and are you actually doing your assessments? How are you, are you really truly evaluating them or not? I think that's kind of the really got me onto this topic, and I thought it was a good one just to bridge. Okay, so my quote of the day is ransomware attacks have accelerated dramatically. What took over 2 months in 2019 now takes less than 4 days on average to execute or less, especially if you start thinking about AI and what you can do with AI these days. So, all right. So the first thing I think this is like the question that was asked earlier was, if it passes Salesforce security review, then that means we're covered, right? Well, that's one of I think one of the misnomers that people think about, and I get this a lot. It's like, hey, has your package passed the Salesforce security review? Because that makes us feel safe. Well, in reality, the security review in Salesforce is it's limited. It's mostly what they're doing is an automated check of the code in the org using the source scanner. Also, if this may be a hybrid app, they actually rely on you to do your own scan and send them the scan of what you're, this a very high level penetration test, or not even that. It's more like a static analysis or dynamic analysis that you did at a point in time. Also, the other thing, what's interesting is there's not really an in-depth architecture. You have to put a little bit of documentation about what it is and what you're doing, but you don't really have to have really in-depth architecture diagrams. They're not really doing a deep dive to understand every little nuance of the application, like what you would do from an internal security review if, let's say, you're deploying your Salesforce application internally out to prod. You would have someone sitting down, understanding exactly how you built it. Are you using best practices? Are there any security gaps? None of that's really being done. Other stuff they're not really, looking at things. We'll go a little bit deeper is like analysis of what kind of, OAuth is even being used, what kind of scopes. And for you that, those of you that are not aware, like OAuth scopes are basically different types of levels of access you can give to your application in addition to what's being given on the profile. For example, do you want to allow them to be able to reconnect as you? Is it a one-time connection? Do you want to give full access to the Salesforce APIs or only certain APIs like the Chatter API? They're also doing no checks for like, post install for, risky endpoints that might be added later. Because basically what happens is they do the security review, the package is now deployed, and then at that point, the provider of the package can actually update the package and no security review is done again. So like we were actually talking about those Chrome extensions, in theory, hopefully this doesn't happen, but what could happen is someone passes a security review, they install the package, and then they then change it to add other types, maybe some malicious components to it. They then publish it, and also the AppExchange gives vendors ability to push updates to your org, and you don't have to allow that. They can just do that after you've installed it, and then they could push malicious components to that package after the fact. And so those are some other things that are a little bit, that are risky, or even just the fact that they can change it at any point in time past the point that Salesforce actually reviewed it. And so and then there's like, pretty much all of this here, like they're not really checking for misconfigurations, not checking for, what are the endpoint, if besides what you provide to them, what endpoints, if those endpoints are actually secure or not, because it's more of a self-reporting of the report, and they say, okay, the report looks good, and that's it. They're not doing like a very deep security analysis, not checking to see if you have ISO certified or other things like that. Not to say that, they're not doing something. They are. They're doing a baseline security check to make sure that, generally it looks like you're building a good application out there and it's getting the rubber stamp, but is by far not fully comprehensive. And so that's kind of be, I would say your first check mark. Okay, great. They were reviewed, but myself included, I would still use an app that wasn't reviewed, but I would just have additional due diligence I would do in addition that I think I would do anyway, whether or not it was reviewed. So the first thing you want to think about, though, when you're reviewing a Salesforce AppExchange app is the different flavors of apps out there. So you have what is called, what a lot of people say native, which I'm coining it as now pure native. That basically means that all aspects of the package are entirely inside of the Salesforce, your Salesforce org. No data enters or leaves the org. It's like no APIs in, out, and no iframes or anything like that. It's all entirely running on the Salesforce org. That's pure native. Then you have native plus egress or callout. So that means they have code, maybe Apex calls an API out. This is one thing that if you see down at the bottom, I put in red, is you want to be careful of, because there's a lot of providers out there that advertise their package as native because it's installed in Salesforce, but then they're doing callouts, which means it's not really native. And that's kind of a danger, that if you don't really understand that, then you may think that it's completely native, but it's not. And then that means your data is actually leaving the org. The other scary thing about that is if they're making callouts, what data, because you can't see the code again, remember, what data is actually leaving in those endpoints out of your org? So that's another thing to think about there. Then you have hybrid. And this is, I think, a very common one, and that's what, like, for example, EzProtect is a hybrid application. And that's where you have a managed package that's installed in the org, but you also have an external server system platform that's running outside of Salesforce, for example, in AWS. And then in that case, like, for example, it's more of common is like an in and out. So there may be callouts from within the package to go out, but also it may be calling in using the REST API. Typical thing you would have using like a connected app with the refresh token so that it can be constantly coming in and re-authenticating to your org. The next type of the last is embedded apps. So think of like using Salesforce Canvas, so people still use that, iframes, just basically having a wrapper around it. So sometimes like maybe you have a quoting application, maybe it's a CPQ, but the CPQ is hosted in all aspects of it for the most part outside of Salesforce. But maybe they just have a tab in Salesforce that lets you do the CPQ in Salesforce, but then maybe it has an integration that comes back in or something like that. That's basically an embedded app. But if the embedded app then has external API calls back in, I might call that a hybrid instead. So the main thing here important is really to understand each of these types, because each of them have different things that you want to consider when you're doing assessing the security and what's happening with your data in these applications. So they have different architectures, really is the better way to say it. So this is kind of, I think, the elephant in the room is, well, why isn't IT security alone enough? And this kind of goes to a talk I did a couple of weeks ago about the fact that there's not a dedicated security role on teams. And I'm going to just kind of reiterate the three things that we learned from the session 2 ago. First is IT security. They understand a lot about security frameworks and about infrastructure security and even web application security, but they don't know anything about Salesforce typically, or very little. Then you have the Salesforce teams who know a lot about Salesforce, maybe not Salesforce security in general, but a lot about Salesforce, but they know nothing about the security frameworks. Then you have the executives who feel like everyone is covered. And so this is kind of where that gap ends up being, because your security team, when you bring on this new vendor, the Salesforce vendor, and they give the vendor these generic SaaS questionnaires that do not look at anything Salesforce specific. They start asking the wrong questions. They say, for example, well, are your APIs encrypted in transit? Well, yeah, Salesforce APIs have to be encrypted in transit. There's no other option. So, and I think that's kind of the problem, because the real exposure is sitting in the Salesforce platform. It's not really outside of it. It's not the infrastructure, but then again, that goes to the taxonomy, because that's where the IT wouldn't have some knowledge if it's all that a hybrid type. So in the hybrid, that's where of course, the security would be good at assessing the server that is being running outside of Salesforce on AWS. But then when it comes to assessing the package that's talking to that server, they may not understand it. And also some of the aspects they may not understand as well. Like, for example, if it's calling Salesforce APIs and it's using connected apps, well, the IT security doesn't really know too much about how that works in Salesforce, so they're not asking those questions as well. And so that's kind of, I think that the main issue is when the security is doing these assessments, they're not really doing them correctly for Salesforce applications. So here are some of the things that just to consider about what's being missed, and some things that you can do and be considering yourself when you're assessing your AppExchange packages. So the first one is looking at insecure flows in Apex classes. So when I say insecure, there's a lot of things. Actually, a lot of it's in my book, but things like, for example, if you have flows without sharing and running in system mode, Apex classes without sharing. If they have a digital experience site you're configuring, you're putting their components in the site. Are you exposing those classes? Do they tell you to expose those classes to the guest user? Or, do they have the right, protections if that's an unauthenticated user or even an authenticated user? For example, if you're using Lightning and you have Apex classes, and you've given that class access to the profile, then anyone that can add, that is user on that profile can access any method in that Apex class if it's been exposed in Lightning. And so maybe they didn't do best practices. Instead of doing security-based classes, they did business function-based classes, and every method for their application is in one class, and then you give it access to the guest user, you give it access to a community user, but some of the methods in there are meant for your community users, some are meant for privileged users. Well, now someone would be able to access all those methods and do things that are destructive in your org. The same thing could be said about flows as well. You could have flows that they could access, and they could trigger the flows programmatically, and then those flows could be doing bad things. And so that's stuff that IT security really doesn't have that depth or understanding about Salesforce and how those things work. So that could be a problem. Same thing with OAuth, as I was mentioning, like with the flows. Do they really need a refresh token? How often does it refresh? Do they need full API access, or do they just do that for convenience? Should they have limited access based on what the application is doing? The same thing here is like, are you rotating the tokens? The refresh tokens, or are they just keeping the token forever? And should you? That's another question as well. Same thing for outbound. Are they hard coding? For example, hopefully, the Salesforce security catches, but maybe not. I don't know. But are they hard coding credentials? Or maybe they put the credentials in custom settings when they should be using named credentials, or external credentials. What are the URLs that are being put in the remote site settings and CSP trusted sites, and the auth providers, external data sources they're using? And when you start looking at those, are those sources trusted? What is that data again that they're sending out, and what security controls are in those platforms that are sending out of Salesforce or coming back in? And then just thinking of like other mass access pathways, like for example, reports and data export settings. Are they in their profiles or permission sets that are in the package? Are they giving, what kind of permissions are they even putting in those permission sets and profiles? Did they put the right permissions in, or did they over permission those profiles and permission sets, giving access to things like a mass data export or other things like that? And then just other like things that like the vendor asks you to do. For example, do they ask you when you install the package to install for all users or admins only? Do they ask you for an integration user, and do they just ask for an admin, or do they ask for an integration user that has only specific credentials? Are they, and also from internally, your own in Salesforce teams, are you sharing that integration user with multiple vendors, which is a really bad thing that I've seen, I see all the time, that because of licensing issues, you may just have the same integration user for every one of your vendors. Well, maybe you trust your vendors, but what if one of your vendors gets breached? Well, how do you know which vendor got breached and which one came and got and access your data? And so that's why it's good that there's now the integration user license. So now you can ensure that it's much cheaper and more affordable to do that. So at the very least, you should have dedicated integration users for every one of your AppExchange vendors. So part of thinking about the security here is not only about the vendor itself, but your Salesforce team too. You're implementing their product. Are you doing insecure things like having that shared integration user? So that's something else to be, when you're thinking about implementing these applications for the vendors, even though it's a third-party application, you need to be thinking about what they're asking you to do and how you're configuring their application. Because you could misconfigure Salesforce, but you could also misconfigure the AppExchange package that's being put in there. And then, of course, the other one that IT security, what we find rarely ever asked about is viruses and file uploads, phishing attacks in Salesforce. They think, you think of phishing attacks outside of, but IT security is rarely looking at Salesforce from that lens as well. So what do you do about this? I mean, the main thing here is creating that partnership again with your IT security, because they know the frameworks, the Salesforce platform levers, and hopefully by attending some of these sessions, you're learning more about Salesforce security as well. And so it's really having the sessions and educating the IT security, the things they should start to look for when they're vetting these packages, because more than likely you don't have the pull to say, hey, we're going to approve those packages, not you, IT securities. That I doubt that will fly in your organization. So instead, what you can do is go and start talking to those people that are doing those security reviews and educating them, maybe putting together some of the guides for them of the things they should be looking for when they're doing these security assessments for the Salesforce packages, have a checklist put together as well for that. And that way you're working in partnership with them instead of having them just run by themselves and working in silo, because you have to look at the entire application as a whole, not just as each little, like, from the infrastructure, kind of what the lens they're looking at. Also, another thing to consider too is when you're looking at these reviews, and these are things that I see a lot of times, is so they ask, my favorite question again is, do you have security encryption in transit on the API? Well, which API? Is it the API that the vendor has defined, or is it the APIs in Salesforce? And so there's different lenses or how do the users accessing the application? Is it the internal vendors users that access from an admin perspective their application? Is it your users as the consumer of that vendor's product, how they're accessing the application? Do you have SSO for your users, or do you have SSO for the vendor's users? I think they should be asking both, but typically there's only one question for SSO. Well, which lens are you looking at for that? And these are some other things that you really should be asking. Hey, Mark, go ahead. I just saw your hands up.
Yeah, can you go back 2 slides?
Sure.
Insecure flows. How would a bad actor access a flow? How so?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's say that the bad actor was an internal user. I mean, how could an internal user use a flow that they wouldn't even know the flow exists? I guess that's what makes me scratch my head regarding the context of how a flow runs, because I've been lazy up until recently, and I just do everything in system mode, which I know is very insecure.
Yep.
But I don't understand why it's insecure. I mean, what could
Why
somebody
system
do
mode?
with it? What
Yeah.
I don't understand what they could do.
Sure. There's a lot of things, but like I think it's going to go back to, like, in the book where I talk about using the Lightning APIs to access programmatically the things that are appearing on the screen. And so Apex and flows are actually can be thought about the same way. Because as I mentioned, you could use, for example, this a tool a lot of penetration testers use, Burp Suite, and I can use if I make the right API calls that I can inspect when the page starts running. I can actually get an inventory of all the Apex classes. I can also get an inventory of all the flows that I have access to as in my profile. And so then once I have access to those flows, well, flows can take inputs and they can also produce outputs just like an Apex class. And so if I can then programmatically kick off that flow, maybe I can change some of the parameters and maybe I can even, or if it's outputting some outputs, I can get that data and do things with it. Or if you think of like if someone's using flows as like you're using flows kind of like in a compostable way or smaller pieces, and you have one flow that does one thing that then returns some data, then that data is then passed to another flow and so forth. Well, if let's just say one of those flows, it returns contact data. Well, I could programmatically with the Lightning API then execute that flow, and then I start changing some of the parameters. Maybe it's a fuzzy match. Well, now I can start really messing with it and I start getting other data out of it. Or maybe I can, if it's doing something destructive, I could send stuff into it to do different things that you didn't intend that flow to do. And so by them having system mode, they have access to all the data instead of just the scope of the data that user has access to. So it's really about how you design those flows to just think about, do you really want, can they manipulate your inputs first off to do something that you don't want to do or get data back that you don't want someone to get back, they shouldn't have with that flow? Or is there other thing, and then same thing with the Apex classes as well. So you want to just be very careful when you're defining them, thinking about, okay, is there anything that they could get that they shouldn't be able to get with the inputs that I'm allowing in and out and using system mode as well? Does that make sense?
I think so. But
Yeah,
we're
and I will
talking
actually
about,
add one other thing really quick to that because I did a talk a while back for one of the users groups about flow security. And one of the other things I've seen people do with flows sometimes is they make this giant mega flow that has these different pathways in it. And some of the pathways they're using it for security purposes. And so based on certain parameters passed in, you might get to certain pathways in the flow and others. And if you have, if it's in without sharing the whole flow, maybe some parts of it you're trying to control programmatically the permissions, but then someone can manipulate that, and then you get to pieces that you shouldn't be need, get to. And so that's kind of another thing I've seen with flows.
okay, but we're
All right.
talking about these bad actors that have to be outside of the Salesforce org, that they've figured out a way to get in, maybe through a phishing attack, and then using the penetration software that you were talking about.
Yeah, yes, I would say yes and no. So I would say first off, you want to limit, and I think we talked about this before in another session, but we want to limit the access that any of your users have. Not because you don't trust your users, but once, like, look at the phishing attacks that happened recently with
Right. Mm-hmm.
Poke and all those. Once that internal user gets compromised, now that person has access to a lot of stuff. So let's say that person gets compromised, and then the attacker knows all about the Lightning APIs, and then they start digging around, and now they can execute all this stuff and get to more data than and have even a bigger breach because of these insecure flows. And so that's kind of the more of the threat from the internal users. External users, then that's of course the case where you could have bad actors come in if it's like a digital experience community that's self-registering or the guest user, and then they could get to data they shouldn't from that avenue as well. Like a lot of times you'll see, for example, flows that are publicly facing for the guest user where maybe it's to submit a case and it's a wizard type flow, and then they're able to manipulate that flow from the guest user. So that's of course another way. Is
I
that
see. Okay, thank you.
Sure. And Dan, I'll go and answer a couple of questions since we're in a little bit of question mode, then I'll continue. You said, do you think Salesforce Labs could be trusted more than other apps in the AppExchange providers, considering providers can update their package? Um, I would say, I mean, Labs, of course, is only done by Salesforce employees. I actually almost created one once when I was working at Salesforce, but I think it's a lot of times it's basically employees doing it on their spare time building the app. So they may not have done the entire due diligence that they should have from the Labs app. I would say that typically the Labs app aren't going to go and auto update things, so you could be more trusted from that perspective. I would say also like the vendors themselves. Hopefully, most vendors aren't going to be purposely doing things malicious if it's a reputable company, and that's part of the vetting process of the company themselves. But at the same time, I think I've seen some labs apps that did things that were insecure also. That just because it was like a quick proof of concept, they put it out there. It was just more of trying to be helpful, and then it was like a starting point, but wasn't actually where you wanted. It wasn't a production ready thing that you wanted to use. And that's I think one of the things about the labs app there. So does that make sense, Dan? I'm not sure if you're on mute or not, but anyway. So all right. So then I'll go ahead and answer your other question as well. It says, can you comment about how bad it is to run flows for all your users to mitigate the impact of the upcoming 10.1 release update to restrict user access to flows? So like you talked to Salesforce the other day, and your CSM said that they were getting a lot of pushback from customers about putting run flows on the PSC profiles. I'm actually not familiar with that update. Dan, are you able to like give a little bit more context potentially? Or is Dan still on here? Yeah, I see you there. I just can't hear you. So yeah, yeah, I don't hear Dan you speaking at all. So I'm not sure how to answer that without a little bit more context. Maybe we can talk offline about that one. Okay, so for now, I'm just gonna.
Hello, Matt.
Oh, there you are. Okay, got it.
Hey, Matt. Matt, sorry about that little technical challenge. Multitasking. Yeah. Basically, on 10.1, there's a critical update that goes live that requires users to either enable your flows on profiles and permission sets so that users can run them, or your user must have run flows on their profile and permission set. So to me, it's a big security risk to add run flows to all profiles and permission sets, and it should be very prescriptive in terms of which profile and permission set can run flows. And it was curious to me that my CSM said that Salesforce is not getting a lot of pushback on this.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, I personally would agree with you that, I mean, because that was the problem with flows, and Apex even originally was there was no profile level access on it. And so I mean it's basically I would say run flows feels to me like view all data, right? You're just kind of opening up broadly across the entire org for everything, and you really wouldn't want to do that. I would shy away from that, and I would say I would definitely use just treat ape flows like they're Apex classes and only give the permission to flows where someone should need to run that flow, since flows pretty much act like Apex nowadays and have the same risks that Apex can have in them as well, since they can do inputs and outputs.
Yeah, check out that 10.1 release update. That's mandatory release update on it's October 1st. It's called Restrict User Access to Flows. It's real interesting that, again, I think it's going to cause people problems if they haven't been very prescriptive about their flow assigning.
I completely agree. I mean, if you could find the link, that'd be great. If you just throw it in the chat for everybody, that would be really cool. So, if not, well, I'll take a look at that as well. So, all right. So let me.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
This is my understanding, and if I'm all wrong, please let me know. So the run flows permission, if it's on a permission set or a profile, that would give that user access to every flow, a blanket permission to use anything, right? But that's not what
understand, but I don't know, Dan, if you have a different understanding.
Yeah, no,
of that.
that's I agree. Yeah, that's exactly what run flows does. Gives you access to run any flow.
Right. And then what you folks are advocating is not using that, but then I'm trying to think of the word surgically, for lack of the right word, say, grant a specific flow to specific permission sets and say, so that it's more granular. Granular is the term I was thinking about. More granular permission to use a particular flow.
Correct.
Okay.
So think of your flows like their Apex classes. It's the same kind of
Mm-hmm.
lens. And you only, because the flows, as we said, I mean, they can do just a lot of the same things that Apex can. And you could do dangerous things, and you should be able to restrict what people can run flows, because you could programmatically, like I said, run flows as well using the Lightning APIs. So all right, so let me get back to the presentation here. Questions are amazing. I think this is some good talks here, and I'm sure we'll have some more as we continue on. So the next thing I wanted to just cover really is, going back to the questions, making sure you're asking the right questions and not the wrong questions when you're asking, doing these security assessments, or even more IT doing the security assessments, and helping them ask the right questions for the Salesforce, and having more Salesforce aware actionable questions and less, generic questions. So like I said here, my favorite one are all API requests encrypted in transit. Well, it's not relevant for Salesforce APIs because they have to be encrypted in transit with, I believe it's TLS 1.2 or greater right now. And so that's irrelevant, but also still, again, using that same lens, having that lens of which APIs are we talking about. There's different APIs. It could be the APIs the vendor manages or the APIs in Salesforce. And so again, making that very targeted and actionable and Salesforce aware. Other things like here, for example, they ask, well, do you support SSO? Well, again, what lens are you looking at? Are you looking at the vendor's application? Are you looking at it in Salesforce? Well, Salesforce already supports SSO, and that's, kind of on the ends. Really, they should be thinking about, like here, list all the connected apps and policies you're using within your application. And same thing with encryption. Looking at, Salesforce manages that at that layer, but how do you work with Shield or field level encryption? Other things here, like going through these role-based access control. Again, what lens? Is it your custom application if it's hybrid? Is it with your profiles and permission sets within Salesforce you're talking about? And so then I would say, like, look at your, show me the CRUD and everything the CRUD that you have and your field level settings, your permission sets in your show me some screenshots. Show me, also, like, if you, for example, in your Apex, show me even some screenshots of maybe your Apex code where you're actually checking for someone has permissions to execute some of that stuff inside that Apex, that you're using best practices. Because since you can't see the Apex, how do you know that they're actually, doing secure practices with their Apex code? One thing I would say with the Apex is I would make it mandatory for everyone for them to give you at the minimum the results of the last code scan that they ran against their Apex. So then you could at least get that baseline that there were no findings, or if there were findings, they have to justify to you the findings in the Apex code. Then I would also do other things to evaluate, asking questions, targeted questions, so you could understand better what is their DevOps like in Salesforce. And for Salesforce development, what does the review process look like? What tooling are they using for their development? Do they understand how to do patching better? Getting them to show the deeper architecture diagrams, basically trying to get that picture that they are thinking about those risks and they're addressing them and they are organized. If they just kind of show you some ad hoc stuff and they don't really have anything to really give you, and they can't really talk about Salesforce security very well, then you might want to actually get on a screen share so you can review some of their code before you move forward with them, because you may not feel comfortable about their code. because you can't see it. So it's a lot of it is trust, but a lot of it means you want some evidence as well. It's like, do you send data to third-party systems? What data? What API calls are you making out of Salesforce? What are the third-party systems? What fields are you sending out of Salesforce? Give me the exact data, the exact data points of everything you're sending out in these calls. What are the calls? Detail out each endpoint that you're sending to, and what does that payload look like? Ask for an example payload of what would be sent out of your org. So that way you know what data is leaving your org for this. I've actually never had anyone ask this question, by the way, of us, saying, what data do you send out of my org? It's just not a question I've ever gotten, which it's really scary to me, and even asking like, okay, how are you doing like your, authentication with these APIs? How do you authenticate? Where do you store the credentials? Are they stored in a secure way? What other things like that. So also, I like this like retention, data retention. Also, residency is a big one too. Where is the data going? What if you're in, for example, Europe, and you fall under GDPR? Are you allowed to send the data to, I don't know, maybe it's hosted in Asia somewhere? Who knows? And making sure you understand where your data is going from a residency perspective. And then, of course, my favorite one of all time is that I almost never get security people even asking it at all when I see other customers doing security reviews and projects I worked on is, are files being uploaded to Salesforce? I mean, are files being virus scanned in Salesforce? It's very rare still that I hear people just come to us. The reason why they came to us is because someone randomly asks the question because they just thought of it. It's not like a standard question people are asking. But my point here is come up with the right questions that security should be asking and give them those questions, help them with those questions. So they're asking the better questions about the different aspects of Salesforce security and what things they should be looking at, not just open-ended or very non-Salesforce specific. Another good one would be, of course, do you use without sharing in your Apex classes? The code scan report should also help you surface this. And then if they do, have them justify it. I mean, I'm not, by default, with sharing is good, especially flows and Apex. But there are valid reasons why you need to do without sharing a lot of times. But you have to make sure they justify it, and then if you do without sharing, then they have in the code, for example, they're checking the permissions that person has access or should be executing that code if you are doing without sharing, for example. So, interesting. That's interesting, Dan. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So, all right. So let's move on here. So there's 4 big risks that you want to really think about and addressing here now, if you want to just dial it down. So first is the managed code. It's a black box. You can't see any of the code that's in these managed packages. So how do you ensure that code is secure? How do you ensure that there's not someone didn't accidentally, as I said in the beginning, is sending your session ID out of Salesforce? Again, it's making sure that you build that picture around them. How knowledgeable are about Salesforce? What's their DevOps process look like? Getting sample screenshots of maybe some of their code once you have an NDA in place, or just doing a screen share with them so you can kind of just do a quick review of some of their code, make sure it looks good. Getting that code scan out of it. Other stuff you can actually use is, for example, is you can reverse engineer kind of what they're doing in some cases. So like you could spin up a dev org that has Shield installed. If you don't have Shield, turn on event monitoring, then you can see kind of the things that they're doing in their package as well. You could also do like for the next would be callouts, like what kind of callouts, what kind of data is leaving your org from a callout perspective. So what are they sending out? Because at least with their pulling data out with the REST API, they would need to create, in most cases, an OAuth connection, unless they sent a session ID out and then they come back in with the REST API. And that's again why you want to be validating these kinds of things with the packages. Thinking about again, like the connected apps. What kind of connected apps do they have? How are they being configured? What kind of scopes do they use? Do they need all the scopes? And then last, of course, think about your integration user access. Are they basically telling you they need full admin access to the org or for your integration user, or are they making sure that you have it's very limited access with that integration user. And then your internal teams, are you sharing it, that integration user or not, across multiple vendors? So so this is kind of the near the end of this talk here, but really what I'm proposing that needs to happen and for this is creating a targeted review framework by type, by that taxonomy type. So you have the different frameworks and the different things that you need to be looking for in the applications, and then being able to test it. For example, if the vendor says it's a native application in Salesforce, then that means there should be no data leaving Salesforce. A good way to test that would be install the package in a sandbox and turn off all, the ability for data to leave the org, no egress. And there, I believe there's a setting somewhere in Salesforce, I forget where, but you can do that. And then if it breaks, then you could also, another thing I've done is delete all the remote site settings. And that if check if they have remote site settings, that's a pretty good giveaway as well. And so if they tell you it's native and then all of a sudden you find that there is egress, then that's immediate fail on that one, right? Looking at then if it's for example, has the callouts, looking for things like, okay, are they using name credentials? If they have callouts but there's no name credentials coming in the org, that would be a red flag. I would personally put a finding if they're not using name credentials, because that means they're probably storing it in custom settings or something else, and it's not a good practice and not secure. What are the endpoints that they're going to, they're using explicit endpoints, like I said, no wildcards, and making sure that the scoping is very minimal for any OAuth applications. Hybrid, this is now looking at both sides, looking at the package, what data is leaving the Salesforce, looking at all the other, configuration types, but then also looking at the infrastructure. And this is where the security team is going to be helpful to partner with you, because now you're looking at, okay, what kind of infrastructure security do they have? How are they using the Salesforce components within that infrastructure security? What does the data residency look like? What are the data flows look like? But then also looking at the managed package as well at the same time. And then embedded is really looking at what kind of client side protections are they using? Do they have, clickjacking, prevention against clickjacking, CSP? There's no secrets being passed on the client side and things like that. And you want to look at as well. And also, with that client side embedded app, do they also have maybe an OAuth? And then it's not really an embedded app, it's a hybrid app. And so looking at that. So basically what I'm getting to is going back to the, for example, the questions to ask, having those right questions targeted at the right app type. And then having, certain evidence that needs to be required and things that need to be done, and checklists by the type of application, not just having a generic, one size fits all thing. Also, and I think it's also, don't take them at their word. Like I said, like if they tell you it's native, then verify if it's native. Make sure that it's doing what they say it's doing. So part of what you should be doing is, when you do bring on a vendor, do a proof of concept, but then not just proof of concept to prove out the business capability, but also a security proof of concept to make sure that there are not any hidden things in that app. So again, looking at remote site settings, looking for named credentials, using Shield event monitoring to kind of see what's happening under the covers of it as well. So those are things that you could use to be able to, start pulling that out. But this is really just talking about creating this framework by that package type, so a more methodical way to do that review. And then maybe you work with IT security to do this, and then when they're doing the reviews, now they have a much better, more targeted review. I actually talked to this guy yesterday, I believe it was, and he was in just general security, and he said that for example, if it's I think he was saying it was like a SAP project or something like that, they have a very standardized way to do the assessment for it, and they have very, certain levels for how they find the findings, and they do it. I know it's for AWS, and he knew, and they actually know to ask for certain things. But then when I asked him about Salesforce, he's like, well, we don't really have that much security and this was a really big company. This is a $1 billion company. It's like we don't really have that much security knowledge internal about Salesforce itself. And so we don't really have as much of a standardized process as we have for some of the other platforms out there. So a couple other things here. Next would be also looking at not only the application, but vendor Salesforce expertise. Is Salesforce their primary offering they're doing? Like, I mean, did they basically just spin off? They already had an offering and they spun off a new product because they just want to take advantage of it, but they didn't want to invest in having a real Salesforce team with real Salesforce architects. Is it a side play for them, or is it their primary thing they're doing? So if you're looking at two different vendors and one vendor has low Salesforce expertise, well, there may be some red flags in their product if they don't know Salesforce very well and they developed a product on Salesforce. There may be security flaws. Do they understand what well architected is? Can they walk you through well architected? That's one good question to actually ask. Do they understand? Are they using well architected principles in Salesforce, aligning with that? What is their team strength? What do they have? Certified experts? Do they have CTAs? Do they have other architect level certifications? What kind of certifications do they hold internally for their own people? And what their support people too? Do their support people are certified in Salesforce? What's the release process look like? Do they have transparency about the architecture as we talked about before? Good like data flow diagrams, system diagrams, anything like that you would typically find in any kind of enterprise project that you would do. Can they provide that to you? What kind of integration hygiene do they? Are they doing what is their data integrations? Again, are they knowledgeable about data integrations? Are they using Salesforce best practices, or are they just kind of just threw something together and hope it works? So this is one of the biggest things that I see is like, I mean, making a lot of these vendors out there don't have a strong Salesforce team, yet they're building a package on Salesforce. How do you know that package is secure? And the last thing is something probably less that all of you have power in, but be that voice to your executives, and from contractual perspective as well, trying to get these get contracts that are put together that are not just this one size fits all. And I've seen contracts sometimes that don't even talk SaaS language in it. I mean, you need to have contracts that are talking the right language, using the right terminology, using Salesforce terminology, not putting all these things that are irrelevant to the Salesforce platform, just putting a bunch of noise in there. They should call out Salesforce specifically, have Salesforce terminology in it, like MFA, like name credentials, like things like that. So not just having your general security terminology that you would find in a lot of the contracts these days, having Salesforce security terminology in the contracts. So and yeah, and I think and again here at the end is basically going to help legally create less blind spots. And so if you do find out in the future they change their product in the future, now they're in breach of the contract because for example, the contract that you must use name credentials, which I've never seen in a contract, by the way. But then, and then you find out later they're not using name credentials. Well, now you have the power to get them to do that if they want, otherwise they'll be in breach. But if you don't have that, how do you enforce it? All right, great. So time for questions and discussion. So I think now at this point, I'm done with the presentation. Open the forum for any kind of questions. If you want to just talk more about the I presented here, or any other questions, the forum is now open. So then let me get the Q&A up here if there's any other questions. Hey, I see Beach is on there. Beach, do you have anything you want to add? Putting you on the spot there, since you'll be our presenter next week, I believe. All right. Thanks, Mark. Yep, the contract terms part is definitely very interesting. That's something that a lot of people don't think about. So, all right, great. Well, if there's no questions, then then we can go ahead and wrap up. But I'll just stay on unless anyone else has any questions that you want answered. But if not, then everyone else have a wonderful day. All right. So it looks like everyone pretty much dropped. So going to and
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yes.
how about how about a future discussion topic on better securing data loader, considering all the data loss breaches in the future, and I'm sorry, that we've seen in the past. Securing data loader is obviously a something that every company should be thinking about. One of the things I was trying to do with event monitoring is, see if we could, have transaction security policies on the version of data loader that's being loaded. But one of the things also was potential to use external name credentials. So maybe some kind of a future topic on data loader would be a good topic, because I know that I'm personally looking at a lot of that stuff myself right now.
Yep, exactly. Actually, it's funny you mentioned that because there's a post by one of the people that runs the London's Calling group, named Francis Pender, and he did a post about how you could better secure from data loader by creating your own connected app for data loader and removing and blocking the out of the box ones, and then repointing data loader to that connected app. So it makes it a lot harder for anyone to have you install a rogue data loader. So that's one of the things. And I was thinking of actually asking him to come on and walk through how to set that up live on a call and talk through some other topics. And hopefully,
I think that'd be a great future topic. So.
Yeah, but please do post, message me directly, or you can, if you have any other ideas for any talks, happy to start putting any other topics out there that are interesting to you. So
Great, thanks, Matt. Learned something here today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. I'm happy that it was valuable to you. So all right, well, I'm going to close out the bridge. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time, and see you next time.